Had Germany won the Second World War and suffered an economic crisis thereafter, it could result in a German civil war after the death of the Fuhrer. So what this would actually look like? Would Germany rebound and keep all of their colonies in Africa and America, while continuing to be the undisputed masters of Europe? Or would it all come crashing down with another world war? In the previous episode, the Slavs started a revolt against Himmler's Germany, so this is practically a 5-way civil war. So let me explore in detail how this would go and what would happen next. Speer's Germany is on a ticking time bomb, having to quickly seize lands and industry as to not suffer rebellions to their conquered territories, which comprises almost half of the country. As Albert Speer wouldn't have the most legitimate government, which is in the hands of Martin Bormann, and Speer didn't have any military experience, this rushed assault would lead to many casualties on both sides. Speer, after failing to push into Bormann's Germany, would rather consolidate control over Holland, where there is an ultranationalist youth stronghold that could be considered as an easier victory, considering that the ultranationalist youth lacking in strong military, economy and governance. As such, Speer's Germany would succeed there, but them taking Hamburg would be a tough task. This is because the Bormann's Germany also wants to take the city, which is actually quite important for both sides. Hamburg is the largest port city within Germany, and controlling it could allow the Kriegsmarine of either side to blockade the other. Furthermore, if Bormann's Germany loses Hamburg, then their possessions in Scandinavia are also threatened. Also, since Bormann's Germany is seen as the most legitimate government, Großbritannien, which is a traditional ally of Germany, could choose to support them with Lend-Lease and volunteers. But looking at the map, these would only arrive in huge numbers via Hamburg and nowhere else. Essentially, Hamburg is really important both for Speer and Bormann as to win the war. Basically, whoever controls Hamburg would later control Scandinavia. The city is currently a stronghold of the ultranationalist youth, whose ideology is the most extreme out of the bunch, so the city would be defended at all costs. All sides except for the ultranationalist youth and the Slavic rebellions would have nuclear weapons, and Heinrich Himmler already used one as to destroy Gothenburg, formerly known as Minsk, so a nuclear weapon being used on Hamburg is definitely within the realms of possibilities. The thing with the ultranationalist youth is that the more they're contained and suffer damage, the more popular their cause would become, which is the establishment of a Fourth Reich that would exterminate all the non-Aryans better than the Austrian painter and create a true racial empire. What I can see happening is while Speer and Bormann are fighting over the Rhineland, the ultranationalist youth, which I would simply be calling the youth from now on, to consolidate control over Jutland and Schleswig-Holstein, making the importance of taking Hamburg even more urgent matter for Speer and Bormann. Quickly going over to Himmler, as you can see, the Great Revolt is taking a toll at his resources, and while the Himmlerites have the strongest army, most of it would be used fighting in Eastern Europe, rather than in winning the German Civil War. Himmler does have parts of Sweden under his direct control, but I don't think that the Himmlerites would have a strong navy, so I wouldn't be surprised if Bormann manages to take Stockholm and the surrounding areas, kicking Himmler out of Scandinavia, and making sure that those soldiers do not return to Eastern Europe. The SS would enforce loyalty via terror and internal purges, so the death toll in Eastern Europe would be greater than you may expect, as the SS would start killing everyone who is non-Aryan under the pretext that they are either resistance fighters, collaborators or simply supporters. The Himmlerites at this point are very likely going to engage in scorched earth tactics, where entire cities would be bombed until extinction, and local villages would be burned to the ground, making Eastern Europe suffer even more damage. In fact, the region would suffer the most this war compared to their entire history, as it would be worse than the Mongol invasion and Operation Barbarossa combined. The thing is, these Slavic uprisings would outnumber the SS soldiers, who despite their brutal tactics would be on the run due to the uprisings disrupting their supply lines. And you already know how important supply was for Germany in the Second World War, fighting exactly in this region. Himmler being Himmler wouldn't retreat, believing in the German superiority and their duty to settle and civilize Eastern Europe, which I'm certain would lead to Russia and Turkestan to join this war, or at least intensify their support for the rebels. The thing is that Eastern Europe was and still is really rural, with the exception of a few key cities that the SS is likely going to destroy via artillery or simply to nuke them, vaporizing the entire populations living there. In our own history, in 1965, the urban population of the Soviet Union was about 62.3%, but it started to increase with the Soviet efforts of urbanization. But in this alternate history, I don't think that this would happen, so quite literally the opposite would occur. Due to General Plan Ost, the Germany attempted to Germanize Eastern Europe. The major cities in the region would become entirely German, where the local people would be forced to move out and to fend for themselves. So the urban population of Moscovian, Ukraine and Caucasian is going to be much lower than in our own history. And due to the increased fertility rates of people living in the countryside compared to the cities, the Germans would struggle to contain the growing Slavic population despite their best efforts. Now, how does this actually play out in this alternate German civil war? Well, my prediction is that there would be about 20 million Slavs living in urban centers, and about 50 million living in the countryside. As Himmler and the SS would be going against the cities, which are the easier to target and destroy as to maximize the damage to the locals, this would very much hurt the 20 million Slavs there, but would further antagonize the rest of them, which is 50 million, not including the support they would receive from Turkestan and Free Russia. What I'm trying to say is that Himmler's efforts at terrorizing people into submission are actually going to backfire heavily, making more people within their controlled lands even more angry and committed to take down the Himmlerites. Russia would advance quickly and seize Perm, which is right on the border with Russia, and it's one of the major cities in the region. This would be very beneficial for the Russians, who would get a quick victory before the Himmlerites can respond, but also seizing an important supply hub and a big population center of about 750,000 people, which in this alternate history could be reduced to 500,000. But still, even if this is the case, it would increase the total population of Russia by more than 2%, which would help Russia quite a lot, as the locals are going to collaborate and enlist in the army as to further liberate more of Eastern Europe. Turkestan, on the other hand, would also advance into Caucasian, where most of the people had already rebelled and the SS was very overstretched, so it could be yet another easy victory, soon consolidating control over the entire region. The SS is quickly losing ground, which likely means that they become even more desperate. It doesn't take a genius to look at this map and say that the Himmlerites are going to be the first to collapse, despite them having the strongest army. Himmler needs to do something very drastic and quick as to make sure that he has any chance of surviving and coming out on top. So far, the Himmlerites were focused on containing Eastern Europe and letting the other German factions fight it out on the front lines, weakening themselves and then for Himmler to come back and take control over them. But this plan has clearly failed, with Eastern Europe now being in an open revolt. As such, the Himmlerites are going to come up with another plan, as this one had clearly failed. Instead of advancing in Eastern Europe and holding out the West, which is what they were currently doing, they would try to do the opposite. Himmler would propose that they dash to Berlin and secure most of Germany, which results in them getting more manpower and industry as to serve the SS, and then the Himmlerites would turn on Eastern Europe and consolidate them, now with more industry and manpower. This idea is a direct inspiration from what the Germans wanted to do in the First World War, which was to take out France quickly while Russia would be too slow to mobilize and become a threat a bit later, much like the Slavic revolutionaries. Basically, Himmler would make a gamble and focus on defeating the strongest faction first, while the East is still weak and disorganized, then turning on them before they can become too strong. The Himmlerites are basically forced to do this, as they, much like Germany in the Great War, are fighting in a war on two fronts, which rarely ends well. So, what do we have as of right now? An ultranationalist youth stronghold in Hamburg and the surrounding areas, Speer and Bormann wishing to take Hamburg themselves, as to prevent it going into the hands of the enemy, and while all of this is going on, Himmler would attempt to seize Berlin and end the war quickly. The German Civil War is becoming quite interesting and more chaotic, especially in the East, where I cannot cover everything. So, on the 22nd of April 1965, Bormann's Germany would enter the outskirts of Hamburg, which would be received with fierce resistance by the ultranationalist youth, who would want to preserve Hamburg and later link up with the Thuringian pocket, potentially taking Berlin, which could secure them a victory. As such, for this plan of the ultranationalist youth to work, they need to hold at Hamburg at all costs, which would make the Bormannists suffer plenty of casualties in the street-to-street combat that would ensue. Bormann has the ability to destroy Hamburg with a nuclear weapon, or even to partially destroy it with artillery, but since the city is vital for Bormann to keep Scandinavia, he would like to preserve it and take it. Speer would see how Bormann and the youth are fighting a bloody battle and decide to sit this one out, letting both of his rivals exhaust themselves and then for Speer to take the city with limited casualties once this is done. This gives the Speerist faction the advantage of regrouping and consolidating their forces, but if they are wrong with their hypothesis, they could risk losing Hamburg to Bormann, and in turn Scandinavia, which could risk them losing the war. So why is Scandinavia so important? Well, to put it simply, there is a lot of resources there, in addition to the control of the Baltic Sea, the North Sea and the Norwegian Sea. Before, I also mentioned that Gross-Britannien would be looking to support Bormann via Lend-Lease to Hamburg, which Peer wanted to prevent. The advances of Bormann into Hamburg would be relatively successful, as the ultranationalist youth is still very weak, but they are growing stronger and more radicalized people are joining their cause of creating a racial empire, ruling the entire earth. Bormann could get close to achieving some sort of a limited victory after a month of attempting to take the city, but then disaster would strike for him. Himmler, that was passive in the German mainland for about 2 months already, would now do a highly coordinated assault on East Prussia and attempt to enter the Brandenburg province via their stronghold in the general government. The thing is that Martin Bormann went all in Hamburg, which is understandable considering the earlier mentioned British support this could get them, but also keeping Scandinavia and their vast resources in check. As such, the most elite Bormannist divisions would be sent to take Hamburg, with plenty of inexperienced soldiers guarding their flank and border with the Himmlerite Germany. As such, the Himmlerites would start expanding into Bormann's Germany, with them taking Königsberg not being an insane outcome, but to the east they would lose ground as a result of them shifting their focus westwards. Remember, the gamble of Himmler was to win in Germany, then to turn east while the revolutionaries are still ill-prepared and poorly organized, so let us see how this would go. The ultranationalist youth is holding into Hamburg for dear life, but the pressure would be alleviated when Himmler starts to advance towards Berlin. The youth in Thuringia may attempt to expand north as to link up with Hamburg and to preserve the city under their control, giving them much needed reinforcements, which I would have almost happen, but still the two are not fully connected as of right now. Himmler is advancing into Germany more and more, but this would be temporarily. Eventually, Bormann would seize his siege on Hamburg and quickly redeploy his advanced troops on the border with Himmler, creating a more even fight that is fought on German soil, which would see the most destruction possible. Now is the perfect time to mention the Polish underground resistance. The population of the Polish people went from about 40 million as to before the war to about 5 to 7 million in 1965, due to the extensive Germanization efforts. By this point, all Polish people would know that they would be wiped out eventually, so they might as well die trying to free themselves. The Polish resistance is by far going to be the strongest out of the resistance groups, being the most prepared and organized. On the 16th of March 1965, the Polish soldiers would come out of the sewers of Warsaw, Krakow and Lviv, occupying their respective cities and freeing the local people under the German occupation. The Polish resistance would go to the cities and villages under their direct control, with the goal of imprisoning the Germans and prevent them from taking up arms and launching a counter-revolution. And then their secondary goal would be to mobilize men and women into the army and motivate them to create a free Poland. Peter, the resistance fighter of our own story, would eventually enter the home of Werner and Nadia. I want to remind you that Werner moved to Warsaw when he was 18 years old and married a Polish woman, whom the Reich wanted to Germanize and produce German children. As their child was already taken by Himmler and the SS, this would be a heavy blow to Werner and Nadia, but now this would get even worse for them. Peter had been a former Polish soldier in the Second World War, defending Poland in 1939 against the German invasion, and now 26 years later, he would finally get to see his sister. Both would be near their late 40s, so they wouldn't recognize each other, and this is where the true horror would unleash. Werner, being a German in Warsaw, but also serving the army during peacetime, would be a thorn in the side of the Polish resistance. The Poles cannot allow Werner to live out of fear that he and similar people may resist the ideas of an independent Poland. Whether it would be during an accident, mistake or intentionally, Peter, the brother of Nadia, would end up shooting and killing Werner in front of her. Nadia's older brother had just murdered her husband. Nadia and Peter would look at each other, not realizing their brother and sister, due to them being separated for more than 2 decades and a half, when Peter would say, "Ci jesteś Polka." At this point, Nadia would freeze. This is her first time hearing the Polish language in more than a decade, as she was only 17 years old when Germany took over Poland in 1939. And with the Germans winning in the Second World War, the Poles were starting to be eliminated at a mass scale, while use of the Polish language was banned and could get you in a concentration camp if you were heard speaking it. As such, Nadia, which was an ethnic Pole for half of her life, would break out in tears in front of Peter, realizing that she has actually forgotten the Polish language in its entirety and has been fully Germanized. Peter would decide to spare Nadia and arrest her, putting her in a local prison in Warsaw, until they decide later what to do with the Polish woman. So, going back to the German Civil War, Speer would make a dash towards Hamburg, as the ultranationalist youth and the Bormanists were exhausted, which results in Speer to take the city, although it would be at the cost of about 200,000 German lives. The ultranationalist youth would not surrender and give up, so they are going to apply scorcher tactics, so Speer would capture Hamburg, but it would be mostly destroyed, with the ports not being usable, so it would be a Pyrrhonic victory. Scandinavia, which consists of conquered people by the Reich during the Second World War, would become more sympathetic to the cause of Albert Speer, who, due to necessity, would be forced to give more local autonomy to the Western Reich's commissariats, which would sit well with Scandinavia. Now, considering Himmler is advancing towards Berlin and that the Bormanist faction is in the middle of fighting almost everyone, them suffering the most destruction could push for Scandinavia to mostly switch sides and ally themselves with the Speerist faction, who would promise them a lot of autonomy or even later on independence. For the sake of this series, I would have exactly this to happen, so it would result in the Speerists to start cleaning out the ultranationalist youth pockets in Scania, Oslo and Stavanger. Denmark and Thuringia would remain the main strongholds of the ultranationalist youth, but they wouldn't be popular at all in Denmark, which if it had a choice would side with the Speerists. As such, there would be mass pro-Speerist revolts in Denmark, with Albert Speer moving in his army as to secure the support of the rebels. A similar situation could also happen in Czechia, where they would much rather be under the control of Speer rather than the ultranationalist youth. Bormann at this point is out of the picture, as his Germany is now the weakest due to their geographic position and the fact that they're fighting almost everyone all at once. Now don't get me wrong, Scandinavia and Bohemia would much rather become independent than to be under the boot of Germany, but at this point they need to choose a faction, and the Speerists are going to be the most lenient who could promise them set independence. As such, Bohemia, similarly with Denmark, has a local pro-Speerist uprising, which is later joined by Speer's army, which would reassert control. Martin Bormann is clearly losing the war, which makes his faction even more aggressive, potentially launching nuclear weapons against his rivals, mostly directed against the Speerist faction, which is by far the strongest. As for Himmler, he would fail to capture Berlin, as Bormann would defend it with his best soldiers, and he would know that if Berlin falls, then his chance of winning the civil war would become precisely zero, so the Himmlerites would fail to capture the German capital. Speaking of Himmler, the East is going to be ready to put up a fight sooner than anticipated, as they would practically overrun most of Moscovian and almost the entirety of Ukraine, with the exception of Western Ukraine, which is barely under Himmler's control, but also Crimea, which would become an SS stronghold. As for the Polish resistance, it would begin to spread out in the lands of the general government and almost fully liberate all Polish majority areas, which would actually end up encircling the Himmlerites in western Ukraine, situated mostly around the city of Fuchstadt, formerly also known as Khmelnytsky. Now the situation of Himmler would be very dire. He simply made the wrong gamble, as his strategy relied on quickly seizing Berlin and for Eastern Europe to coordinate slowly, neither of which happened. So the SS is near extinction, with a similar fate falling upon the Bormanist faction. As such, with Himmler being the most dangerous, would launch all of his nuclear arsenal mostly into Eastern Europe, using tactical nukes as to slow down the Slavic rebellion. Bormann would also be nuking Speer, while Himmler would be nuking the Slavs. Speer may choose to retaliate against the Bormanist faction, but this wouldn't be beneficial for him, as it would only make the youth and the Himmlerites take more land instead. So Speer is going to focus on eliminating the ultranationalist youth, where using nuclear weapons could become the only way to achieve total victory sooner. Ironically, the use of nuclear weapons causes the least destruction, as if a war was fought conventionally, it would end up like Stalingrad or Warsaw during the Second World War, where about 80% of the cities were practically destroyed. As such, cities like Dresden and Leipzig would be nuked by the Speerist faction, which would only bolster the popularity of the Fourth Reich, but they are already too weak to pose any sort of a threat, so Speer mostly takes control over these territories, with Bormann taking the coastal areas. The ultranationalist youth are going to be fully defeated and are the first faction in Germany to fail. Of course, they would never truly surrender, but considering the scale of the war, their local resistance would be negligible for this series. At this point, Albert Speer looks like he's going to be the victor of this German civil war, and I think it would be the most likely, due to him controlling the Rhineland, his ability to produce war equipment during hard times, but also the fact that he was the only one not to fight on two fronts, having his western flank secured. Speer would advance to take Berlin, which would be 20 kilometers or 15 miles away from his stronghold in Potsdam. So Speer now holds the capital city, greatly bolstering his legitimacy at the expense of Bormann. Members of the Bormannist and Himmlerite faction are going to see the writing on the wall and prefer to switch sides, rather than to fight a losing battle. Himmler would be assassinated either by a pro-Speerist faction or by a Slavic resistance member. Either way, he is out of the picture, and order in the Himmlerite faction would totally collapse. While Bormann would continue to hold on, but become increasingly more irrelevant, so Speer would eventually take these lands as well. Here comes a character you maybe didn't expect to hear, and this is Finland. The Finns are likely to take advantage of the chaos and take Lapland, with them pushing for the Sami majority areas not being too impossible, but as to not get in conflict with Speer, they would settle for something less. Back to Germany, at this point many of the warlords would have used strategic nukes, which would cause the most destruction but result in a rather short war. I would say that this conflict was about 1970, so it would be 5 years of brutal nuclear war. As for the death toll, it would be impossible to predict, but we don't do realistic scenarios on this channel either way, so this is what I came up with. For the military deaths of the German soldiers, it would be between 4 and 6 million, with 10 to 15 million German civilians also perishing during the war, either from the brutal occupation, reprisals, scorched earth, or being straight up nuked, or even dying of famine. As for the Slavic rebels, they would see about 10 million military casualties and about 15 million civilian ones, due to the brutal methods applied by the SS. In this German civil war, Eastern Europe is actually going to suffer the more losses and devastation, despite most of the war being fought over Germany, and this is all due to Himmler. This means that Himmler in this alternate world is the ruler directly responsible for the most deaths caused, as Stalin and Mao Zedong, which are argued to be responsible for more deaths, wouldn't exist in this timeline, so Himmler is officially the worst human being in this universe. Now let us look at the peace treaty that would fall between Albert Speer and the Russian revolutionaries, which is the easiest to cover. Russia wanted to annex Muscovian and Ukraine, while Turkestan wanted Caucasian, all of which would be allowed by the Speerist Germany, which, let me remind you, wanted to pull out of Eastern Europe regardless, as Speer saw Germany's problems stemming from their occupation of Eastern Europe, which was not profitable and being a resource drain. Speer also gives up control of Crimea and Adolf Hitler's Stadt to the Slavs as a sign of goodwill, despite the Russians not claiming these territories directly, but it would be a welcome gesture. Regarding Ostland, as I covered in previous episodes, it would be actually fairly Germanized by this point, with the majority of the population being ethnic Germans. As such, I can see the Belarusian borderlands to be given to Russia as well, but Germany gets to keep the rest of Ostland, which now, considering they lost some non-German territories, would become about 75% ethnically German, leading for it to be annexed into Germany. This is one matter settled, but let us also look at the other territories where Speer would grant local autonomy, which could later turn into full-blown independence. Belgium and the Netherlands are going to be the first ones to receive these privileges, where initially they would have the rights of self-rule and later self-determination. Scandinavia and Bohemia would also follow next, as well as Switzerland. Looking back at the war before the peace treaty, you would see plenty of Estonians and Latvians surviving and collaborating with the resistance. These people either receive out of autonomy or more likely push for independence. The problem is that this hypothetical United Baltic Duchy is going to be very irrelevant without the German majority lands, so for the time being they would be part of Germany, but receive local autonomy. Now comes the biggest challenge of Germany and the series as a whole, which is Poland. The Polish resistance would understandably want to create a free Polish state, to which Albert Speer is more than guaranteed to agree, but the question of its size would become the main problem. The Polish nationalists would face a dilemma, either they take their former territory or agree to a more compact Poland, neither of which is a great outcome for them. If they take their former territory with some border adjustments, then this version of Poland would be about 90% ethnic Germans, due to the mass killings of Poles that happened between 1939 and 1970, which basically means that there was an ethnic cleansing and assimilation of Polish people for 3 entire decades. The Polish nationalists would like to take as much as possible as reprisal and punish the Germans, but the new state wouldn't work. The other alternative is that the Polish nationalists only agree to take the former general government borders, which is still going to be about 63% ethnic German, so it wouldn't be feasible as well. But also the Poles would become an irrelevant country in Central Europe, so this is a tough call to make for the Polish resistance. Simply looking at the ethnic map I made about the year of 1965, which is before the German Civil War, you can see that there is not a lot of Polish people left alive, so Poland is in a really bad position. What I can see happening in the Polish resistance to take the borders of the general government and start expelling Germans as to form a majority there. But this is going to be a long process, so no matter what, Poland is the worst hit nation in a scenario where the Axis win the Second World War, which I think is a surprise to no one. In the end, the borders of Europe right after the German Civil War would look something like this, with the German puppets potentially breaking away later. Now the video is actually far from over, as this German Civil War will change not only Europe but the entire world. First up, Japan is scared and increasing their control over their subjects, but nothing major will change for the Japanese, as I already covered their strategy in the previous episode. The American-Canadian state is likely going to fully conquer the German America by 1970, where a process of denazification and de-Germanization will take place on the US East Coast. America would rebound, their industry would start to boom, and they would have several hundred nuclear weapons under their direct disposal, but Japan is still a threat to the West Coast. Africa is a tough call to make. The German part broke away from Germany and likely became several warlord states. And honestly I can see them all starting to fight each other, while suffering nationalist rebellions of native Africans, opposed to the ultranationalist and exploitative rule. There would be a slogan, "You stole our continent and enslaved us," would become really popular with African resistance, fighting against their white German superiors. I cannot predict the exact borders, so this is all up for interpretation. As for South America, I think that the Spanish-speaking realm could consolidate control over Colombia and then to strike Brazil, which would be a thorn in their sides for a while. The Spanish-speaking countries would like to partition Brazil, while the Brazilians would want to expand even further and reach the Pacific coast. Remember that all countries in South America by this point are heavily ultranationalist, as they were influenced by the Germans, so a continent full of expansionist ultranationalist powers that hate each other would go about as well as you would expect. I would assume that there would be total war in South America. Let me zoom out on the world map so I can show you what this actually looks like, so you can see that Russia and America have walked a long way and are starting to revert their national humiliation, but there are still a lot of unresolved conflicts in South America and Africa. Now I want to briefly cover Russia, Turkestan and Poland. The Russians and Turkestan are going to remain good allies, agreeing to drop all identity claims on each other, with the goal of preserving peace and making the region as a whole prosper. Poland by this point would be a very small country that is barely Polish anymore, and they are likely going to have great relations with Russia. The thing is that the borders don't really make sense, as there are Ukrainians living in Poland and Poles living in the Russian country. Poland may fear that Germany could strike them again, which is actually a valid concern, as by 1972 Germany would rebound from their civil war, which would deeply scare Poland. I think that the Polish representatives would agree to join Russia, which could become a federation looking similar to the United States of America, which means a federal government with local autonomy, with the goal of defending the liberty and freedom. Poland can join as a separate state and thus avoid conflicts with Russia or Germany. While this idea may be unpopular with the Polish nationalists, many would understand that this is needed, as Poland, with a population of about 3.5 million, where 63% were Germans, cannot defend itself from Russia, which likely has about 100 million people, and Germany, which also has more than 100 million people themselves. Russia, as I said, would become a proper democratic federation, giving their peoples rights that they never had in their history up until this point. Turkestan joining this federation is also an increased possibility, but for now I wouldn't have this happen. The country would adopt this cool flag and would be called Vostokoslavia, which means East Slavic. Yes, you have heard of Yugoslavia and Zapadoslavia, now get ready for Vostokoslavia. And yes, Vladivostok means exactly what you think. The reason for the name change is because of the Ukrainians, Belarusians and other East Slavic nationalities. So the Vostokoslavic Federation would identify with the region and group of people, rather than it being just Russia. For now, however, I would have Poland sign mutual treaties of friendship with Vostokoslavia, but not join the federation just yet, which I think is understandable by both sides, as Russia conquered so much land that they need to consolidate it first before adding new members. Just know that for now Poland is independent, but is on very friendly terms with Russia. Back to Europe, the immediate aftermath of the German Civil War would be unfortunately one of famine and radiation. Let me start with the famine aspect first. Before I covered how Atoantropa was going to cause a famine in southern Europe, with the areas in red not being able to produce any food. This would hit Germany very bad during the Civil War, but now with the Germans losing their breadbasket of Ukraine and even southern Europe, this likely causes a famine in Germany, which would make the anti-German resistance even more popular. So you could say that Speer's Germany is barely holding on, and his grip on power is far from being secured. Take this as the calm before the storm. Millions would die in Germany as a result of a famine. As for the radiation aspect, hundreds of nuclear weapons would be used during the war. Parts of Ukraine, Belarus and eastern Poland would become uninhabitable. Not to speak of the major German cities of Dresden, Leipzig, Hamburg, Königsberg, Danzig and likely even more, which would be nuked during the German Civil War. The areas in red would be uninhabitable, with the orange areas being ones where civilians wouldn't be allowed to enter due to the increased radiation. In yellow, people would live, but food wouldn't be grown, as it wouldn't be safe to be consumed, leaving us with not a lot of green areas that people can thrive and food could be grown, as most of the green areas are up north due to climate, food production and mass settlements are suboptimal. So I would color the colder climate with grey, so the people can realistically thrive only in the green areas. I would also add Atoantropa in this mix, where the problem is not radiation, but rather the salty desert that it has created. And down south in Africa, the climate would be too hot, so I would also grey this area out. What I'm trying to say is that as a result of Atoantropa and the German Civil War, where nukes were used, Europe as a whole would become quite inhospitable, which only increases discontent and results in more wars in the region, as each nation would now fend for themselves. In the previous episode, I alluded that Italy and Hungary would start eyeing up Croatia, which wouldn't be affected by the war all that much and still be viable for food production. I can really expect an invasion to commence, even during the German Civil War, but for the sake of simplicity, I would cover it now. Basically, as Germany is busy fighting itself, many nations will take this opportunity to start to expand during or after the war, but the specifics are of course impossible to predict. For the sake of simplicity, let us say that this Italian-Croatian war starts in 1975, so 5 years after the conclusion of the German Civil War, which is when tensions between Italy and Croatia would boil over, but also the poverty in southern Europe would make Italy want to act or risk total collapse. So how does Croatia fare against Italy and Hungary? Well, as Croatia would lose their main backer in the face of Germany, they are left isolated, but Romania is more than likely going to step in and defend Croatia. This is because Romania knows that if Croatia falls, then Hungary would get stronger and the Hungarians are going to keep northern Transylvania, or even try to expand it into the entire region, so Croatia collapsing would be an existential threat to Romania. There is going to be a third Balkan war, because more than likely other countries get involved. The Bulgarian nationalists would lay claim on northern Dobruja, while Slovakia is in the same position as Romania, where if Hungary expands, then Slovakia may cease to exist, so they are forced to join this war. Serbia, on the other hand, is hated by both sides, and each claims Serbian lands, so the nation may collapse into a civil war or be invaded by both sides, as Romania wanted to reach Croatia, which would be isolated if Serbia is not attacked. This war is not only about territorial expansion for some and survival for others, it is one of resources, as farmland would become very scarce in Europe, due to Atoantropa and the nuclear disaster which was the German Civil War, so the Balkans are going to be the least affected in Europe, resulting in stronger powers like Italy wanting to expand there and seize these resources, or risk collapsing themselves. By this point, Italy would have annexed Greece and Montenegro, and while there would be some revolts there, it would become negligible. Now, the question of does Turkey involve itself into this war would come up, as they could join the defenders and seize Bulgarian and Greco-Italian territories, but also eliminate Italy as a threat in the Balkans and in the Middle East, which would preserve the Turkish Empire. Italy also holds plenty of Arab and Muslim territories, so if Turkey is successful, they can call a jihad and liberate these territories, so this conflict is going to become really tense and one of survival for both sides, fighting over limited resources, which is farmland. So to recap, as of now the world has 3 major conflicts taking place, the one in South America, one in Africa and one in Southern Europe. Currently the year is 1975 and the world tension is going to boil over as there are so many unresolved issues. I cannot predict how this war in Europe would escalate, but I would say that Russia and Turkestan would invade Turkey and Romania. The Romanians are invaded by Russia over the Transnistria region, where the ultranationalist Romanians would be committing unspeakable acts to the local Slavic population. As for Turkey, there is a similar position of ethnic cleansing in the Caucasus, but also Turkestan could claim these territories. Poland would also side with Russia due to the fact that they want to help out, but also see some Slovak lands that Slovakia took after the Second World War, which were a few villages. At this point, Japan would have enough, as if they don't act now, Russia would become too unstoppable and challenge their empire in Asia, so Japan also gets involved, which leads to the United States of America, Australia, New Zealand and Free India to declare war on Japan and reclaim their former territories, but also restore the old world order, which was one of stability, peace and democracy. Germany at this point would have briefly recovered from the civil war and may choose to join the Japanese side, with the aim of retaking Poland and the east. France would join the Italian faction as to restore what they previously lost, while Spain would join the ultranationalist faction, wishing to preserve their gains, leading to Portugal to join the democratic faction. Britain, being an ally of Germany, would join their side, while Ireland would go with the Democrats. All of Europe is now fully at war by the year of 1975, but it would get even worse. The wars in Africa are likely going to be carried over, as the ex-German colonies are going to side with Germany, while the African rebellions are going to side with the democratic faction. The war in South America may escalate as well, with Brazil being more desperate and having benefited more from the world order led by Germany, who would join the ultranationalist faction, while the Spanish-speaking realm would join the democratic faction. Now I want to reiterate that this war in South America may remain as a separate conflict, but given the stakes, I think that it could escalate and almost all of the entire world would eventually find itself at war, starting the Third World War in the year of 1975. Now I want to clear up some questions that you may have. No, this is not realistic in the slightest. The second question you may have is why Italy is siding with the democratic faction, and the reason for this is because if Italy is victorious, then they can retain their empire, so this alliance between them and America is not one of shared goals, but rather shared enemies. Think of how America and the Soviet Union allied against Germany in the Second World War. The fact is that Italy wouldn't side with Germany, considering the German subjugation on Italy earlier and the many points of friction between the two sides in this alternate history. Italy also started to democratize and give local autonomy to the conquered people when the German Civil War had started. The Italians did this not because they liked the conquered people, but because they had to do this as to keep their empire. I mentioned the famine in Europe and the lack of arable land, which pushes this conflict to start so soon after the German Civil War, and for the sides to look like this. The war is more so regarding the world order. The Germans and Japanese want to preserve the current world order, where they were at the top, while the Americans and Italians would want a new world order where they are leaders. So far we are more than 35 years after the point of divergence, and it ended up in a drastically different timeline, so everything I say here is just too unpredictable at this point. I chose the war to look like this because I think it creates for the most interesting scenario. Here, either the ultranationalist side wins and creates an even darker universe than I previously explored, or the pro-democratic faction comes out on top and restores stability to the world. This I would explore in the next episode, so check out the video on the screen to watch some more of my videos. I really thank you for watching this episode and I hope to see you another time. Goodbye.